especially want to thank Stephan, who's been my good friend for a long time, colleague in a lot of these adventures. The remote viewing that I'm interested in talking about is our ability to expand our awareness to describe and experience what's happening at a distant place or a distant time. The most important property of this ability is that we're able to look into the distance or into the future, and increasing the distance from the viewer to the target in no way interferes with your ability to see the target. It's no harder to see something 10,000 miles away in Soviet Siberia than it is across the street. An experiment you can do that makes this very clear is if you have a friend that you want to share telepathic experiences with, you can put your head right next to your friend's head, hold an image of something real or imaginary, and invite your friend to describe the image that you're holding. And if you're able to stabilize your image, you will find that your friend is able to describe that to a greater or lesser degree, and you can learn to do that, noggin to noggin. You can do that same experiment sharing a telepathic image 10,000 miles away, where you would expect the signal to have fallen down by 10 billion times because radio signals fall off at the square of the distance. And as you go from a foot away to 1,000,000 feet away, you would expect the signal to fall down by the square of 1,000,000, 10 to the 12th times. As Sagan would say, billions and billions of diminutions in the signal, and that doesn't happen. We don't know a lot about psychic abilities. One of the things we know is it is no harder to see something in the far distance than right next to you. Another thing we know, which is actually more interesting than that, it is no harder to describe a target object or an event that's going to occur tomorrow than to describe one that has already occurred today and is hidden from you. And hundreds of experiments have been done to investigate this. Princeton University with Bob John and Brenda Dunn have done 410 remote viewing experiments at Princeton, exploring whether it's more difficult to look an hour a day into the future than it is to describe something that's hidden right now. And there's absolutely no evidence showing that it's harder to describe something which is not yet chosen, that is a future event. It's no harder to describe the future than it is to describe the present. And those two facts are not disputed. Parapsychologists are a very contentious lot, and we find many, many different things to argue about. But we agree that it's no harder to look into the distance than into the near proximity. It's no harder to describe what's going to happen tomorrow than it's going to happen today. We would call such a phenomena a non-local ability, a non-local phenomena. Now, the idea of non-locality is not a metaphysical principle. This comes to us from the most interesting research currently being done in modern physics. Modern physics is interested in describing experiments that occur in the world. The idea of non-locality, as it's described in modern physics, says that many things that appear to be physically separated by time and space are actually connected to one another. Now, physicists hate this idea. If I'm doing an experiment in Virginia Beach, and I'm in real life, I'm a laser physicist before I became a mystic. So I've spent thousands and thousands of hours standing at a laboratory table doing stuff with lasers and mirrors and plasmas and optics. And I would like to believe that if I have the stuff on the table in front of me, I'm pretty much in control of my experiment. I don't want to have to worry about what's going on down at the NASA facility in Hampton, Virginia, or what the people in Washington are doing. I'd like to feel that it's under local management, that if I have an experiment on my table, I'm running the experiment. That's what physicists like to believe. And physicists are an arrogant bunch. They like to feel that they're in control of their experiments. So it's very disappointing to a lot of physicists to discover that we live in a non-local world. Henry Stapp, the chairman of the physics department of the University of California, said recently that the discovery of non-locality is probably the most important discovery in all of science. And that's because it is a discovery that so countervenes our ordinary understanding of the reality in which we live that it causes us to rethink a great deal of what we've taken for granted. This idea of non-locality is worth, I can give you the answer. I know you're going to think that non-locality came from the Buddhists or the metaphysicians. The idea of non-locality was first enunciated by Einstein in 1935 in a paper that he wrote with two colleagues at Princeton, Podolsky and Rosen. So this is known as the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen theory, or EPR, as it's affectionately known. And Einstein had the observation that quantum mechanics predicted that particles that were born together and then separated would still remain connected to one another, would remain coherent, even though they traveled away from one another at the speed of light. And Einstein hated that idea for a number of reasons. Principally, he hated the idea is that it appeared to violate special relativity, which he invented with his wife, and had been well substantiated in laboratories, and he had received a Nobel Prize. And general relativity really was a integral part of modern physics. There couldn't be anything wrong with it. It's geometrically shown to be right, yet quantum mechanics predicted that there is this anomalous connection between things traveling away from each other at the speed of light. That's why it was initially called the EPR paradox. And that's the way things were until 1969, when two researchers at the University of California, Friedman and Clauser, did the experiment on a tabletop. They sent photons from an experiment in opposite directions, turned the polarizer on the left to catch the photons, and an observation was made that the photons on the right had apparently changed. This is a shocking result. They said, well, maybe they're just not far enough apart. So I'll run to the conclusion. In 1988, Nicholas Geeson at the University of Geneva did the experiment off the tabletop, making use of the wonderful fiber optics phone lines in Switzerland. Geeson had a laser experiment where he was in Geneva, one collector was off in Zurich, another one was off in Basel, 10 kilometers away, and what he observed is when you turn the polarizer in Basel, the photons in Zurich become incoherent with their partners 10 kilometers away. The idea of non-locality is no longer controversial. It's another thing that physicists agree. They don't particularly understand it. It's going to need another generation until all the old physicists die, and then a new generation grows up with non-locality, and they'll say, oh yes, things are non-local. Grandfather Einstein said that a long time ago, and we know that that's true, and it'll become accepted. The uses of psychic abilities really depend on what your goals are. There are many interesting things you can do with psychic abilities. For example, you can use psychic ability to find your car keys or to locate parking spaces. We have successfully used psychic abilities to invest in the silver commodity market. In 1982, working with an enthusiastic investor and associated remote viewing, we made over $100,000 in the silver market and were on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. We had 9 consecutive successful forecasts for whether silver would go up a little, up a lot, down a little, or down a lot. And all 9 of those forecasts were correct. And to do anything 9 times in a row is phenomenal, especially when you're investing money. The following year, we were not successful. It didn't work the following year. A number of things changed. As the Buddhists like to say, it's very hard to step twice in the same stream, because the stream has gone by, of course. One of the things that changed is our investor, who had been sharing the money with us wanted to share now unequally instead of equally. He also wanted to do experiments twice a week instead of once a week, which interfered with the ability we had to give feedback to our subjects at the end of the trial. The things got rushed. And after we had won this $100,000 in the market, it's fair to say that we lost our spiritual focus. The first time around was, at least in a sense, for science. We want to see, can we make money in the market? Is there going to be a problem? Is God going to prevent us using psychic abilities to enrich ourselves? And there's a lot of lore to that effect. That we were able to make money in the market. Initially, we wanted to see, is it possible to use psychic abilities to support our research? The second time round, since we had done this without error, our focus was, as Hal said, are we going to pull the silver market? Are we going to make so many billions of dollars that the whole silver trading scheme won't work anymore? The market will collapse or something. Anyway, we didn't have to face that because our silver forecasting was not successful the following year. Or in my opinion, the most important thing you can do with psychic abilities is to discover who you are, to do research into who is here, who is investigating the question, and who wants to know. To use the ability not so much to enrich yourself, but for self-inquiry, self-liberation, and to expand your awareness. And I'll talk about those possibilities. In addition to looking out into the distance and looking into the future, psychic abilities have been used to diagnose illness. And several books have been written on that ability. And probably the most interesting thing that I'm finding about psychic diagnosis is that it's shockingly more easy than remote viewing, little known fact. I've been doing experiments where my teacher will come and give me a number of envelopes containing file cards, and the file card has a description. Each file card has the description of a person who has some illness or something the matter with them. I'll pick up an envelope and then try and describe what that person looks like. This is a kind of a cold reading that sounds very familiar to most of you, I'm sure. It's a rundown. Silva Mind Control did this successfully. S did this successfully. And the reason they do it successfully is that it's anomalously easy to do. The reason you have the card in an envelope is you don't want your instructor to know who the person is you're trying to describe, because otherwise you will quickly instruct yourself to respond to their breathing, their nods, their eye movements, their affirmation of those correct things you happen to say. So it's very, very dangerous to do any kind of psychic testing, whether it's remote viewing or medical diagnosis. It's very risky to do any of those practice things where the person you're working with knows the answer, because you quickly condition yourself to respond to the subliminal breathing and motions of that person. So you, in my opinion, you must do this in a double-blind way, or you'll get success, but you'll have deceived yourself. You won't be doing what you think you're doing. This sounds like a very analytical task, because you want to be able to describe what's wrong with the person. The two very interesting books written on this subject are both written by physicians. There's a book called Second Sight, which is written by Judith Orloff, who's a psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, well known to Stephen and me as a journeyman remote viewer, very psychic, spiritually minded woman, connected with the divine, and very experienced teacher of intuitive diagnosis, Judith Orloff. The other one is Mona Lisa Schultz, who's an MD, PhD psychiatrist at Boston University. She's much more of a risk taker, fast-talking, humorous, not remote viewer, medical intuitive, and she has a book called Awakening Intuition. So both of these books are very illuminating with regard to how to do medical diagnosis. Barbara Brennan is another person I should mention. She has a book called Healing Hands. Probably the reason there's so many people teaching it is because it's so easy to do. If you want to get in touch with remote viewing and quieting your own mind, that's an easy way to do that. So all three of these things that I've been describing, there's precognition, looking into the future, forecasting silver, looking into the distance, and medical diagnosis are all of the form of inflowing psychic abilities. Should say one other word about precognition. The most common kind of precognitive ability that people have are, of course, precognitive dreams. And Louisa Rhine says that that's by far the most common experience that a person has with anything psychic, is to dream about something that's going to happen in the future. We had a contract monitor who was in Detroit with his partner, and he had a very frightening dream about a plane crash. Now, this is a man who's been on thousands of airplanes and never worries about them. But this was so vivid that he decided not to get on the plane, but he didn't want to appear a wimp, so he just told his partner that he has one more thing to do in Detroit before he goes back to Washington. I'll see you in Washington, I'll drive you to the airport. And he drove his partner to the airport, and as he drove away, he had a chance to see his partner killed in a plane crash. Now, I don't say this in any way to be condemnatory toward our contract monitor, because it's just a dream after all. So you say, where did that dream come from? Because after all, he was not killed in the plane crash. So what I would say is that he had a dream about the shocking plane crash that he saw the following day. That is, Wednesday's plane crash experience caused him to have a dream of a plane crash the previous night. And then in dreaming about that, he dramatized the event to put himself on the airplane. So that if you dream about being killed in an accident, I strongly believe that it is not necessary to have the accident. I think you can use information as you travel along your world line, as you travel through the space-time trajectory that we're all on. I think you can use your psychic information to lift yourself off this material plane of reality to gain information about the future and give you an opportunity not to experience the future that you don't like. But you can tell which of these dreams are precognitive in many cases. A precognitive dream is one that is not based on the previous day's residue or on the things you're wishing for or on the things you're worrying about. For example, if you have a dream that you failed an examination and in fact you have not studied for the exam, we would not consider that a precognitive dream. But if you have a dream that is bizarre, contains elements that are not part of your ordinary life, things that you don't normally think about, or a dream that is extraordinarily crystal clear, dream people like to call this dreams of preternatural clarity, then we would say that that dream might be precognitive. So dreams that are your ordinary anxiety dreams that we have our share of, and dreams that have residue from the previous day, of which we have many, these dreams are generally not precognitive. It's the surprising, unusual, bizarre, unusually clear dreams that often are precognitive. And you can learn to recognize them. And very good training is if you think you're having a precognitive dream, you should tell somebody about it or write it down. Because the way this precognition game is played, the remote viewing game is played, is if you don't tell anybody about it, you don't get credit for it. So you have to be willing to go out in advance and describe the dream you had. So we've talked about precognition, looking into the distance, inflowing healing. inflowing medical information. The other aspect of psychic ability that's not been spoken about here before is distant mental influence, where you can outflow your healing intentions. And the data for distant healing is really quite good. My daughter Elizabeth, who died a year ago, was a psychiatrist at California Pacific Medical Center, and her passion was distant mental influence, distant healing. And 2 years ago, she did a landmark experiment where she had people around the United States praying for 60 of her AIDS patients who were very sick. These are San Francisco men who are dying of AIDS. And she divided these in a random protocol into two groups, one group for whom prayers would be said, and the other group who would receive no prayers. And then, with the help of experienced distant healers from many persuasions, Catholic prayer groups, spiritual healers, energy healers, psychic healers of various description, Native Americans, whole variety of different healers. She had 20 different healers praying for her 30 men. So there were 10 healers praying for each of the men. So you're unable to tell which of these strategies actually worked. But she wanted the experiment to work. That was the main thing. And after 10 weeks, the blind was broken, and what she found is that the 30 men in the prayer group had done much better than the controls. The people who had been recipient of distant prayers had fewer opportunistic illnesses, fewer trips to the hospital, fewer days in the hospital, and generally better self-esteem, self-report, highly significant in all those different variables. And she was able to publish these findings in the Western Medical Journal, which is a mainstream medical magazine, and has stimulated further funding for distant healing from the NIH. Because of course, distant healing is much cheaper than putting people in the hospital. So there's great interest in supporting this kind of work. Since then, there have been other experiments done, famous series of experiments done by Randolph Bird at San Francisco General Hospital. He had Catholic prayer group praying for his cardiac patients. There are 300 patients divided into two groups, and again, the people who received the prayers had much better outcomes. And William Harris at the University of St. Louis had a huge study with 1,000 cardiac patients where he had people praying for half of his patients, and this was published in Annals of Internal Medicine. So all three of these papers are peer-reviewed, published in mainstream journals, double-blind experiments showing that, without a doubt, the prayed-for people had better outcomes than those who received no prayers. Now, Elizabeth's data had a much greater effect size than the other two studies. That is, it's not to say it was more statistically significant, but she got a level of significance from many fewer studies because she worked with people, all of whom had at least a decade experience as a healer. The other studies worked with people who were well-intentioned but much less experienced. So similarly at SRI, we had anomalously strong success because we started out our program with people like Ingo Swan and Pat Price, who were very experienced, very gifted in remote viewing, and then we got very lucky in choosing some other people who turned out also to be very psychic. But if you're going to do an experiment of this type, it's good to work with people who have a lot of ability, obviously. So the two types of phenomena that I've been talking about are inflowing psychic information, either precognitively from the future, with ordinary remote viewing from the distance, or doing medical diagnosis. Or you can outflow your healing intention to affect the health of a distant person, to relieve suffering or relieve pain. And the evidence for that is really quite strong now. Between the inflow of information and the outflow of your healing intention has got to be a quiet place between the inflow and the outflow. In that quiet place, you have the opportunity to experience many of the phenomena that the mystics talk about. Jesus talks about the peace that passes understanding in that quiet where you've learned to reside in order to do remote viewing or medical diagnosis. The Buddhists talk about Ananda, which is a transcendent quiet and peace that's free of suffering. It's as though you found a way to reside in a quiet, loving space. In the Vedas, they say when you quiet your mind, you discover that you have within you the love you're looking for. It's not outside. Carl Sagan spent a lot of time describing how he turned over rocks and looked through his telescope, and everywhere he looked, he could never find God. And I believe that that's because you don't find God in looking through a telescope. And in order to find God, you have to be quiet, which is a thing that Carl Sagan famously could not do. All the mystics say throughout all history that everyone's looking for love. And what the mystics teach is that when you find some methodology to quiet your mind, to quiet the chatter, you discover that you have within you the love you're looking for. The earliest Vedic teachings, which was 1,000 years before Buddha, the most prevailing, most important teaching was Atman equals Brahman. Atman is your own awareness, your own soul, your own large self. It's your awareness. Your Atman is who you are. Brahman is all there is in the universe, the greater universe, including God. It was a universal teaching, the basic Vedic teaching, 1,000 years before Buddha, is that there was no difference between who you are in your own awareness and the greater universe. I'm sure you immediately catch on, this is a very non-local teaching. There's no separation between your awareness and the entire physical and non-physical universe. Erwin Schrödinger, who is the man who perfected quantum mechanics in the 1920s, and then went on to invent the idea of genetic code in the 1940s. So Schrödinger is one of my heroes, one of the obviously most creative, smartest men of the 20th century, said that the idea of Atman equal Brahman is the most profound of all metaphysical teachings, because it summarizes in 3 words the basic spiritual teachings of most of spirituality. It's the idea that we reside as bodies, that is, we recognize that there is awareness residing as a physical body, but that physical body is not who we are. As we can tell, all the remote viewers here know that they're not physical bodies, because you sit here and your awareness is able to travel anywhere you want, can travel out to the lighthouse on Atlantic Avenue. Your physical body is still sitting in the chair. Your awareness can travel to the lighthouse, can travel to the future. The work that Stephan Schwartz has done in psychic archaeology, your awareness can travel to the past. And the data for this is impeccable. There's no doubt that our awareness is not tied to our physical body. There's 100 years now of published, refereed scientific data, and many of you have had that experience. There's no doubt that our awareness is independent of our physical body. So what it shows is that the idea of the religion of materialism is basically bankrupt. Doesn't make any sense. If we're science-minded people, that idea simply doesn't make any sense. Because we obviously have an awareness that is independent of the physical body. And one of the goals of the ancient metaphysical teachings is to have you discover some way to have that experience. And that's the teaching of Atman equal Brahman. Now, in the Buddhist teachings, so Buddha came perhaps 1,000 years after the early Vedic teachings. Buddha was a mystic. He did not ask you to believe anything. Buddha's teaching is very non-controversial. He left his palace and sat in the woods and looked around, and he said, my observation is that in the world there is suffering. Nobody disagreed with that. He said, as I look around, there is suffering, and in general, people don't like that. He said, seems right to me. He said, as I look around and study the situation, there is suffering and people don't like it and it's unnecessary. And everyone said, tell me more. And the teaching that he had is really very straightforward. You're all quite familiar with that. And that is, we create suffering by our thoughts. That we give meaning to things that happen to us. That is basically, we sit there, something happens, and then we assign a meaning to it. And this is just like one of the things we do to interfere with our remote viewing. Same phenomenology. You see a picture, you say, aha, that looks like Macy's. Whereas actually all you saw was a curve in space. What Buddha taught is that we give meaning to things that happen to us, and from that meaning we create a kind of cage. And when we then paint ourselves into the corner of that cage, based on the meaning that we've assigned to things, and when we then suffer the claustrophobia and suffocation and suffering from the meanings that we assign. Now, in contemporary teaching, the Course in Miracles says we give all the meaning there is to everything we experience. And that seems to me an obviously true syllogistic kind of argument. It's obvious that we give all the meaning there is to what we experience. The contrary idea is that things occur, somebody says something to me, and that has intrinsic meaning. Well, we know that that's not true. He said something based on his experience. I can then decide whether it's as though I collect blue chip stamps and somebody hands me a red chip insult, and I can decide I don't have any place to paste that insult. I give it back to him. I don't have to collect any insult that's handed to me. I have an opportunity to experience what's happening in the physical universe, and then I have the opportunity to give meaning for it, meaning to that. The suffering that we experience is very largely the creation of our own awareness, the creation of our own prejudgment. And what Buddha's taught is that there is really no separation in awareness. So he taught that separation is an illusion. One of the things that Schrödinger said, being a Vedantist, he said that consciousness is a singular of which there is no plural. The appearance of many consciousness is an optical illusion, as though we're in a hall of mirrors. And this is the Buddhist teaching. As you read the Prajnaparamita, which is the collection of Buddhist teachings, every page contains the idea that there is no separation in consciousness. The universal Buddhist teaching is that we are one in consciousness, and therefore we should be compassionate, because every gift you give, every act of compassion that you provide to the world, you participate in. It's obvious that we should be compassionate because there's only one of us here. So there's a universal Buddhist teaching, and people who look at that find that it has a kind of mathematical simplicity, that it's not clear why anyone would disagree with that. It's not asking you to bow down before a golden statue of Buddha, but it's as though the Buddhists and the people who followed present a kind of geometry of consciousness. They have a dynamic that makes fundamental sense. After Buddha, there were a number of other teachers who were of great interest to me. They're the kind of Buddhism that I'm studying called Dzogchen Buddhism, that's interested in not so much the release of suffering, but rather the expansion of consciousness. In 800 AD, Padmasambhava, who's an Indian, carried Buddhist teachings to Tibet. Well, Padmasambhava is a great hero. In in a sense, invented Tibetan Buddhism. There was no Buddhism in Tibet before Padmasambhava came to Tibet. And what he taught is that along with the idea that we give all the meaning there is to what we experience, that our lives are controlled by our conditioned awareness. And he talks about the necessity for recognizing our conditioning, that we've all been betrayed, we've all suffered, we've all been hurt. Everybody's experienced suffering, betrayal, hurt, religious teachings, bad parents, nasty children, crazy bosses. We've all, I will find some way you've had to deal with some crazy person who's conditioned you to recognize that particular kind of craziness, because that's what we've all experienced. And that can condition every subsequent thing we experience, and is a source of suffering, and creates the prison in which we live unless we can learn to recognize that and not participate in that prison. What the Dzogchen Buddhisms talk about is that we live in a prison of conditioning, but as we begin to wake up, it's not that we escape from the prison, but we discover that it doesn't exist. So it's a very liberating teaching. And the idea is that you trade this conditioned awareness, which is a source of suffering, and you trade that for naked awareness, experiencing things as they are. In Ingo's terminology, Ingo Swan's terminology, you get rid of the analytical overlay. We all live in a world of analytical overlay where we assign meanings to what we experience that interferes with our experiencing it. And the fact that we assign those meanings prevents us from experiencing our lives. Because our conditioned awareness is of the form, we are worried and guilty about what's happened in the past, and we're frightened about what's going to happen in the future, and as a result of that is that we never get to experience the present. And that's a source of suffering, because we live in continuous anxiety and never get to participate in what we're doing. So what my new friend Padmasambhava is talking about, he's talking about self-liberation through seeing with naked awareness. Naked awareness is what we strive for when we overcome what Dale Graff called naming and guessing, together with the other analysis, memory, and imagination that interferes with remote viewing. All of these things are kinds of analysis that we do on our experience. We analyze what's happening. We imagine how it corresponds to something that's happened to us in the past. We have memories of things that have happened to us in the past that remind us of them. All these various kinds of nagging memory and imagination is what Ingo calls analytical overlay, and the Dzogchen Buddhists call conditioned awareness. It's a cause of suffering, and it is a necessary interfering factor with remote viewing. Cannot help but interfere with remote viewing. Naked awareness is experiencing what's happening without that conditioning. And the goal of this is to move from naked awareness to what the Dzogchen Buddhists call is timeless experience, timeless awareness, where you are freed from this plane of awareness, which is what you do where you reside in a peaceful, loving space, you're experiencing precognition, you're healing the sick, you're diagnosing illnesses, and you are unbounded by the limitation of ordinary physicality and suffering. You found a way to release yourself from this kind of analytical overlay. What Padmasambhava teaches is that it's critical to overcome this conditioned awareness. He said that you must overcome conditioned awareness if you're even going to hear the words happy life. He says that it's like the very first thing you have to do is to recognize the extent to which your past experience is coloring and determining your present experience, and find a way to free yourself from that. And the reason I'm dwelling on that is because it's exactly what you have to do in order to do remote viewing. That is, there is no difference. That is, analytical overlay as described by Ingo is exactly the same as these ancient Buddhists and Hindus and Dzogchen teachers talked about. The great teacher of the past, Patanjali, who was only 100 years after Buddha, said that union with God is mind wave quieting. If you can just find a way, that's the very first line of the Sutras of Patanjali. It's another great book written 2,000 years ago that's still in print, called How to Know God by Patanjali, the Sutras of Patanjali. The first line of the Sutras of Patanjali is yoga is mind wave quieting. If you're going to experience God, you've got to stop the chatter. And what he says is that as you stop the chatter, you will find that you are looking into the distance, looking into the future, healing the sick, and diagnosing illnesses. But of course, you don't want to get attached to these experiences. This is just phenomenon. There are many paths you can take that are in the general area of what we call self-improvement. Patanjali, the Dzogchen Buddhists, Padmasambhava, the subsequent people, Longchenpa, who's a much more contemporary 14th century writer, he's the one who most speaks to us. That's my experience in reading Longchenpa's books. They are written in such a way as to present a new experience of consciousness that changes your experience. It transforms the way you experience reality. Very, very magical. In fact, they say, Longchenpa says that the experiences you will have in this path of expanded awareness are magical, limitless, and ineffable. And we physicists always get in trouble when we start to F them, because that doesn't work within our prevailing ontology. But these ancient masters, these Dharma masters, completely understood the phenomenology of what we're trying to do here. This remote viewing is embedded in the Dzogchen teachings, that they understood it, they knew what the problems were, they understood mental noise that interferes with psychic functioning, they understood why it interferes, and they understood how to get rid of it. So I think with that, I will show you some of the slides. So if we could dim the lights. This is a beautiful painting by Ingo Swann illustrating conditioned awareness. We have a tendency to reside inside this eggshell. This is the eggshell of conditioned awareness, or analytical overlay, where we're obstructed and occluded from seeing what's really available. So what we want to do, what the Dzogchen Buddhists want to help me do, is move from this area of conditioning to this area of timeless existence, where you spend a lot of your time experiencing spaciousness. See, when I talk about these Buddhist teachings as not that concerned with suffering, the Dzogchen Buddhists have assumed that you've taken care of the things that used to cause you suffering. You found a way to open your heart. You're no longer suffering from things that happened in the past. And what they're inviting you to do is reside in a mental arena of spaciousness rather than where we tend to live normally. So it's, whereas Mahayana Buddhism, the middle path, gave rise to the Bodhisattvas, who are the compassionate, the Mother Teresas, the people who have compassion for the world, which I obviously admire and strongly support. The Mahayana Buddhists are heart-centered people. Dzogchen Buddhists can be bodhisattva, helpful, dedicated people, but it's a trajectory of spaciousness and timeless awareness that provides nourishment for the mind as well as for the heart. So it has a different objective. That is, for me, the mantra or the idea of Dzogchen Buddhism is spaciousness and timeless awareness. And Ingo has depicted that very well here. And this painting is really an inspiration for me to climb out of this cloudy region of conditioning into the region of spaciousness. That's the metaphor that this has for me. This is one of the first remote viewing experiments that Hal Puthoff and I did with the policeman Pat Price. Price came to us saying that he had used his psychic abilities all his life to catch criminals, as he was a police commissioner in the city of Burbank. And many pictures I'm going to show you here represent a kind of psychic hide-and-go-seek that the government paid us to explore for many years. In these cases, someone would stay in the laboratory with the psychic du jour, whoever that was, whether it's a government scientist, an SRI scientist, a congressman, policeman, whoever it was. Since you've probably caught on that my vision is very poor, so I don't drive. So in all of this decade of work, I was a stay-at-home person. It's as though the CIA provided a teaching trajectory for me where I got to sit in the dark for 10 years with my eyes shut. So somehow I was a psychic spy for the CIA and found God. Most people have a different spiritual path, but this one worked for me. Because what I learned to do is help many hundreds of people get in touch with the part of themselves that's psychic. So that was my path, to share experiences with these people. So as I sat with Pat Price in our electrically shielded room, Hal and our contract monitor went to Rinconada Park. So what Price described as a round pool, it's 100 feet in diameter, he said, a rectangular body of water that's whatever it is, 86 by 75, and he drew this little rectangular building, and he said, that's what I see. There's 2 pools of water in a building. Hal then came back from where he had been hiding, which is a swimming pool complex. The pool is actually 110 feet in diameter. The other one is 75 by 100, and there is a little building there. So Price sat back, closed his eyes, polished his glasses, and described this place 5 miles away to about 90% accuracy and made a little architectural sketch. So we thought that was very amazing. And we were concerned, of course, that Price said that there's 2 water tanks here. He said there's a water purification plant. And we were happy to say, well, this is analytical overlay. Price is experienced in the building trade, and his analysis of this watery place led him to think of a water purification plant. And as Hal mentioned, that was our story until 5 years ago when Palo Alto had its centenary, at which point I got a picture book showing Rinconada Park 50 years ago when it was a water purification plant, and the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto were these 2 water towers just where Price had put them. So you then have to think again as to what could be going on here. The observable is that Price moved his awareness 5 miles down Rinconada Road to describe this randomly chosen hiding place for our contract monitor, and then he moved his awareness 50 years back up the timeline to describe the most interesting thing that was there. So we learned from that we have to ask our remote viewers, describe where the people are hiding and tell us what it looks like right now. The most famous experiment that we did with Price, and is good for probably a decade of funding, the CIA, Hal and I went to the CIA for funding since we were constantly looking for funding. And John McMahon, who's a courageous head of intelligence at CIA, said, you guys are wasting your time looking at churches and swimming pools in Palo Alto. We have places that really need a description. I will send you an agent with coordinates and see if you can describe what's there. And the CIA man showed up, gave me the coordinates. I went up to our shielded room with Price, and as Hal described, Price closed his eyes and said, I see some kind of complex full of buildings. As I lay on top of one of them in the sunshine, I see a giant crane rolling back and forth over my body. This crane is so big that it has a set of wheels on each side of the building, and he made this little drawing. He had opened his eyes. We took this to the CIA man. He then unrolled this big satellite photograph of the place. It was all secret, of course, and said, "You're apparently looking at the right place. These two greatly resemble each other." Of course, we knew the crane was there all along, so you're really not telling me anything that I didn't know, which is one of the hazards of doing experiments that you'd like to be verifiable. If they verify it, they say you haven't provided any new intelligence. If they don't verify it, they say, "How do we know you're right?" So this is a classic double bind kind of, a double bind, not a double blind. So he said, "Well, what are they doing inside this building?" So Price went back and closed his eyes and described the fabrication of a large metal sphere that's being welded together. He said the sphere is 60 feet in diameter, made of thick metal. And a year after that, Price unfortunately died. And 2 years later, satellite photography showed a giant steel sphere being rolled out of this building. And Aviation Week said that the sphere was probably part of a particle beam weapon designed to shoot down the satellites that were taking these pictures. So as a result of that great success, Hal and I got to be the subject of a congressional investigation. So we got to stand in the well of the House of Representatives, just as our last esteemed president got to. And our opportunity was to defend our program to see if there was any security leak that could have given us this information, which no one in the Western world had at the time that we provided it to the CIA. Of course, no security leak was found. Our contract monitors supported our work and told us to press on, which we did for another decade. This was a success story. We were looking to see the effects of increasing distance. So this is an experiment where I'm still trapped in the shielded room at SRI. Hal has gone to South America, and Pat Price is a viewer. We're trying to describe each day where Hal has gone, and we're getting no feedback. So each day, Price will say some South American kind of thing. He'll say, "Hal's at the marketplace. Hal's at the volcano. Hal's gone to the seashore. Hal's in a big church." And the next day, Price didn't show up. So and of course, we're getting no feedback, but this is an important, expensive experiment. So in the spirit that the show must go on, I'd been sitting with Price now for several weeks doing experiments. I understood what he was doing. He closes his eyes and describes what he sees. I had the idea that I'd probably been doing that for years. So I closed my eyes and just said, "This is an experiment, and Pat Price isn't here." What I see is an airport with ocean at the end of the runway, a hangar on the left, grass and sand on the right, put a date there and drew the picture. That was it. Took 5 minutes. It was my first remote viewing. So when I know that, no offense, but I know that there are classes to take in remote viewing that charge thousands of dollars and go on for long periods of time. My opinion is that if any of you who's interested in learning remote viewing, if you will find a friend and play this hide-and-go-seek game or do something like this by hiding a small object in a bag, you will be astonished at how easy this is to do. When Hal and I started, there were no remote viewing sites on the internet. In fact, there was no internet. Good reason. 20 years later, there's 115,000 remote viewing sites. The reason there's 100,000 remote viewing sites is that remote viewing is really quite easy to do, and people all over the world are discovering that they can do it and are teaching their friends. So when Hal came back from South America, he had indeed taken a side trip. He'd gone to an island off the coast of Colombia, and this is the airport at San Andreas where he was at the time I made this little drawing. And judges had no trouble matching that at all. I mean, the very good news here is that even a scientist can have psychic ability if the necessity level is high enough. Now with this picture, I'm finally let out of the box, and I'm traveling across the U.S. to different places. And in New Orleans, and chose a target site by throwing a die on the pavement. I know James Spottiswoode won't think that that's an ideal way of choosing targets, but it seemed I had a little picture book with a dozen places in it, and I just threw a die to choose a place to go, and wound up with the New Orleans Superdome, which I thought was a pretty good target. Meanwhile, Gary Langford, another SRI physicist, was the viewer. Langford had not been an experienced remote viewer, but he was using his psychic abilities as a photo analyst to look at grainy pictures for the intelligence community at SRI and describe what was inside buildings that were represented by a single grain of photographic emulsion. So Langford turned out to be an extremely valuable photo interpreter because he could describe things way beyond what was there. So he heard about our work and said, I think I've been doing that for years. And in an experiment, I stood out here at the New Orleans Superdome creating what Ingo would call telepathic overlay. My contribution was to stand here and be a beacon person, say into my tape recorder, I'm at the New Orleans Superdome, which looks to me nothing so much as like a great flying saucer shining in the noonday sun. Now, how related the problem that created, Gary is sitting in his screen room talking to the monitor and says, I don't know how to go forward here. I close my eyes and all I see is this damn UFO. Do you think Russell's been abducted? And the interviewer said, just describe what you see, which is our shibboleth. That's all there are only two or three things you can say to a remote viewer. In general, the first thing you say is, tell me more about whatever it is you've just told me. The other thing you can say is, what are you experiencing that makes you say what you've just said? Those are basically the two non-directive things that you can always say to a remote viewer. They tell me more, and what are you experiencing that makes you say that? Because you're asking them to describe their mental pictures. Since only they know what their pictures are, they can't be wrong in that regard. So you can always encourage the viewer, just tell me about your pictures. You can't be wrong. Only you know what your pictures are. Just describe them. And the phenomenology will take care of itself. I'm going to show you three pictures by Joe McMoneagle. This is the Stanford Art Museum. Joe McMonagle's very first remote viewing, sitting with me in the laboratory. He described this building. As you see here, Hal told you about this experiment. Joe drew a number of different things around the edge and said that it's basically this building. Joe is the first of these 6 Army officers that we worked with from Fort Meade. I'm eager to show you 2 other pictures of his, because in the work that J.B. Ryan had done at Duke University, people always got worse. There was a decline effect, because people were bored by seeing circles, squares, and stars, and because they always knew what the target was, there was a kind of extinction from analytical overlay. So J.B. Ryan found that people inevitably declined. It's as though Ryan found a way to extinguish ESP in the laboratory, which was not at all what he was trying to do, in addition to setting the basis for scientific parapsychology. In this case, Ed May was the interviewer. Joe was in the laboratory. The CIA man who was testing us said, I'm going to visit 2 places, one at 10 o'clock, one at noon, and then I'll come back. And I don't know where I'm going, but I want to look at your pictures when I return. The first drawing Joe made, I show at the bottom here, he said the person has gone to this 6-story T-shaped building covered with glass, and there's a row of trees here. Where he'd actually gone is this 6-story building covered with glass, T-shaped building at Lawrence Livermore, which is our own atomic bomb factory. And you notice that there is a row of trees just where Joe put them. So this is 10 years later after he started with us. The next place the man went to was the Ultima Windmill Farm, 150 miles east of SRI. Joe said, I see foothills, there are tall power poles here, part of an electrical grid. Something is rotating on the top and I can't see what it is. And again, Joe's picture greatly matches the one I show at the top. So 10 years later, Joe has become even more capable than he was at the outset. No decline here. We were asked to find a control subject. We'd worked with Pat Price and Ingo Swann, and CIA wanted to find out how an ordinary person would do. And the ordinary person we chose was a dear friend of mine who's a Life magazine photographer. She promised me that she had not done any psychic things like this before, and our control subject, Hella, turned out to be the most reliable person we had in the program. This was the first trial we did with her that Hal described in detail. It was important for me because this was the first time that I had to sit down with someone who had never done remote viewing and tell them what to do. So in the end of this trial, Hella said, if I look where Hal is standing, I see these squares within squares within squares, which greatly replicates what Hal was seeing at the pedestrian overpass. 10 years later, we were still working with Hella, who was a great technophobe. That is, she luckily didn't have to deal with computers, and it was basically all she could do to change the batteries in her light meter. So one of the targets that we chose for her was the Berkeley Bevatron, which is a particle accelerator at the University of California. So this is in a way a dirty trick to give somebody such a complicated thing. She says, when I close my eyes, what this looks like is some kind of belly button shaped energy expander. And here's the belly button, and the energy comes out here, and it goes over to there. Now what she's actually drawn is this circular energy expander, which is the Berkeley Bevatron, together with the 4 buildings that collect the energy. So it shows that even, and this is all she did, this is her whole output, closing her eyes and describing this immensely complicated thing. And you can see it's even more complicated if you look at the aerial photograph. She then said, let me make a clay model of this thing, as Ingo was doing. And again, you can see her belly button and the 4 beam tubes. So this is, again, a striking example. You remember Hella's a control person, no previous training, came into the program, and was able to show us striking remote viewing. So I invite you to take advantage of these opportunities that are available and see if you can find a way to include remote viewing into your lives, to participate in this expanded awareness, and make use of spaciousness. So that these things are available to you, peace is available. I invite you to follow this path and find happiness, and above all, be in love. Thank you very much.